Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to WyomingPBS.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
At the Wyoming Legislature, the time for introducing legislation has ended, and the time for passing legislation has begun. I'm Steve Peck of Wyoming PBS. Join us now for Capitol Outlook.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And by the members of Wyoming PBS. Thank you for your support.
I'm Steve Peck of Wyoming PBS, and welcome to Capitol Outlook. We're happy to be joined this morning by two Wyoming legislators from Casper, State Senator Bill Landen from District 27 and Representative Art Washut from District 36. One senator, one representative. And you told me something interesting, that Senator Landen, that Representative Washut is your representative in the House.
Well, that's exactly right.
You guys are citizens too, and you have representation in addition to being representatives. And the same goes for you as well.
I'm nested in his district, so
that's
my senator.
A fun way to look at it. You guys are both from Casper. Did you know each other before you got into the legislature?
Oh, we sure did. Yeah, Bill and I go way back.
Really?
The good senator and I were employees at Casper College together, and went to grad school together for a while, and so we've been acquainted for many years.
What's your field outside the legislature?
You know, I spent 20 years as a police officer and administrator in Casper, and then I went to Casper College, started teaching criminal justice and political science there at the college.
Now, I know Senator Landen from years ago. We both were newspapermen in Riverton. I more recently than he was, but remind us what your occupation was outside the Capitol.
Well, you know, Steve, I was really lucky. I came out of the University of Wyoming, went to work for the Riverton Ranger, and spent time at the Casper Star Tribune. After that, I was hired by Dr. Lloyd Lofton to go up to the college and help them with their information effort, and I finished my career there. Got to teach a little bit and spent a lot of time in the administration there. And once in a while, I'd stop by Representative Washut's class, and we'd have a good visit about what we do down here in Cheyenne.
Now, you told us before we went on the air that you encouraged him to consider running for elected office.
I sure did. It took me a while to get him convinced to come down here, but we're sure glad that Representative Washut is down here doing the work of the people.
You've been in the legislature for more than 15 years now, correct?
That is correct. 16 actually, and that time's gone by pretty quickly. It's an amazing privilege and quite an honor to be here.
And Representative, you're in your second term?
Third, just started my third term.
When you thought about and listened to the entreaties of your colleague here and considered running for office, what factors entered into that for you?
Largely my wife. She was very supportive and encouraging, and kept reminding me about our kids and grandkids and how important the future of Wyoming is for them, and said she thought I'd be good at this type of work, and off I went.
Well, interesting. We're here now we're in the back half, the second half of the legislative session. We're not right down to the wire, but we can see the finish line ahead. You both are on the Judiciary Committee, and in fact are the respective chairs in the Senate and in the House, and that committee occasionally meets as the Joint Judiciary Committee, where you share those duties. This is committee number one when you look at the list on the legislative directory. It's an important committee. Is either one of you an attorney?
No, we're not.
When we think of the Judiciary Committee often, and right. I think so many people have a better immediate familiarity with the U.S. Congress. Well, the Judiciary Committee is the bunch of lawyers, and of course that isn't always the attorneys even there, who do primarily their biggest, most visible national duty is confirming judges. Does the Wyoming Judiciary Committee do that?
No, our system is governor makes the appointments, and then the people get to decide Do we like your appointment, Governor, or do we not?
Because the judges are on the ballot from time to time.
That's exactly right. Our state bar works very, very hard on that front to send forward the 3 nominees, and then the governor takes a look at them, and the process has really worked well in Wyoming.
So how would you describe, just in general, what the Judiciary Committee's overall typical responsibilities are?
Well, Steve, it's one of the busiest committees in the legislature, and it's actually an honor to be asked to chair the committee. I've chaired several other committees while I've been down here. This one is a lift because of a lot of the bills that come there. And the Judiciary Committee takes up bills that really matter to people, that really matter in their lives. And when you're dealing with law enforcement and the judiciary branch, it's important work.
Typically tend to be, there's some law enforcement, some sentencing elements that come into things that the judiciary takes on. One that's been a general issue that's been of increasing interest around the Capitol this year has been this issue of trespassing sort of in general. And I know we've talked about this, one of them, this corner crossing issue where an outdoors person, a hunter, a hiker might step from one corner of a piece of public land onto another, instantaneously crossing a piece of private land. That's not been your issue, but you have had one that is connected to it in a way, and it has to do with what a private landowner's rights are in dealing with someone that person believes could be trespassing. Representative Washut, you have a law enforcement background, as you said. What's your take, and brief us on what that issue is?
So Representative Craigo brought us this bill as a constituent bill. He was approached by someone who in his district that asked him to consider this. And the basic argument is that when it comes to criminal trespass, the common law, case law suggests that, a bouncer can evict somebody from the premises, or, an usher could bring somebody who is disruptive in a church service out the front door. And there's an application of force. We're not talking about beating someone, but grabbing them by the elbow and getting them out the front door that's a use of force. And so the question was, should statutory law incorporate that common law principle that a private property owner or his agent can use reasonable amount of force to get the trespass to end?
And at the moment, it doesn't exist in law specifically.
Not in statutory law.
Statute.
Right.
Where does the bill stand now?
Well, passed the House and is on the way to the Senate.
So we get it next.
And in reading it, and I've not nearly as, of course, well versed in it as you guys are, but it's one of these that that has some general sorts of language in it that I know can be problematical when you get into something that you're trying to codify into law, and general use of force or appropriate use of force. How do you approach those issues and try to narrow it to a point where it can pass muster as a statute? Is there any way?
I think one of the important things in this bill is there's a caveat at the end that says this bill in no way changes use of force law or self-defense law, that is specific only to the application of reasonable force to get someone to stop being a trespasser. And I think that was an important inclusion at the end, that it's not dealing with use of force per se, or more importantly, self-defense law, that those laws are separate, well established in Wyoming case law, and so this doesn't touch those.
So in other words, if you're on my property and I bash you over the head, then I would be subject to, say, an assault and battery statute that already exists.
Exactly.
And couldn't claim protection under this law were it to pass.
You might be able to claim that your application was a reasonable amount of force given the circumstances. But in terms of whether or not that was justifiable self-defense, for example, that's a whole separate area of law that this one doesn't touch.
What are you hearing about it in the Senate? Is it?
Well, we're getting a lot of emails on that one. A lot of our sportsman friends are concerned about the bill. And I think it's just simply because of their, inadvertent crossing of a property, and sometimes, even with GPS devices, et cetera, there's still the chance, you can end up at the wrong place, wrong time. So some concerns rolling in on that front. And that's why you have to land these bills in the right spot.
When you hear testimony will it come to a committee again, or is that part of it over for this particular?
Done in the House.
It actually starts all over in the Senate,
will.
and so it'll be read in and sent to committee. I assume that one will come to Judiciary, and then the Senate committee will work that hard for and try to send it out of committee and back up to where it goes through 3 readings in the Senate.
Mm-hmm. At which point it could be different, probably would be different from the version that the House passed, and then you
After
Boy, then
conference.
the 2 chairmen sit down and wrestle over how that bill comes out.
What sort of, who testified typically? What kind of testimony did you get, and from what kinds of individuals?
It really varies. That's on all these bills. Some of these things that we deal with over the interim, we take lots of public testimony through the summer, and then we get down here and a whole bunch of new stakeholders surface and want to chime in, which is terrific, and you get that input. But in this one, obviously the sponsor of the bill brings it to you, and the constituent who asked him to bring the bill testified about why he thought it was important that we have this law, because many other states have codified their trespass removal law, and we're one of the few that hadn't.
And that's something that you aren't afraid to look at. What are states near us doing? They might be ahead of us on this. There might be something we could learn from them.
I think it's important. It gives you some guidance. On the other hand, it's developed into a little bit of a concern, because we have a lot of what I like to refer to as cookie cutter type bills that are coming from elsewhere. And sometimes those can be square pegs that we're trying to put in a round hole. So there's some of that can be informative, but I like to treat it that way, just as information. Do it our way in Wyoming. So
we've had the Senate President, Senator Driskill, on Capitol Outlook a couple of times already. He made a point of saying that his preference was to delay some of the bills that might have the more intense, personalized kind of debate on them until later in the session. And one of these is an abortion bill that's moved through House Judiciary, I believe. And you, Representative Washut, you cast a deciding vote that moved that bill forward. And tell us quickly what that bill's all about.
What this bill is a response to the ongoing litigation over last year's House Bill 92, the trigger bill. And so based upon some of the arguments that have been made in that case, and recommendations from counsel that have been involved in that and similar cases, a new approach has been drafted and brought forward, which is believed to be perhaps more defensible. And we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, for viewers who might not have been following it very closely, the trigger law that was passed last year that you referred to was intended to take effect in case Roe v. Wade was overturned, which in fact it was. I'm not sure anyone at that time thought that was imminent, but it turned out that it did happen. The law then was to take effect. It was in effect about that long, as I understand it, and now a judge has said hold up on it. So that the previous law governing abortion in Wyoming, in which it was legal and with some restrictions, is now still in effect. So this would address that again. You expressed, even at the time you voted to advance it, you expressed some doubt about that. What was that in your mind?
Well, I remember my mom teaching me the old adage about a bird in the hand versus 9 in the bush, right? And so we have trigger, House Bill 92, law of the land, passed by the House, passed by the Senate, signed by the governor, working its way through the judicial review process.
As everyone understood that it probably would.
Exactly. And this bill, House Bill 152, repealed the trigger bill. And so you're going, boy, that was what gave me a lot of pause, was, we're going to flush the bird in the hand in hope that, the new law is more defensible or a better rendition. And that gave me a lot of pause.
But you decided, at least at the committee level, that it was worth moving forward to at least get to the floor.
Yes.
One member of the committee, who an earlier guest on our show, who is an attorney, Representative Oakley, likened it to being a horse race, and the horse is 3/4 to the finish line, and you say, well, whoa, we're going to start back again and get maybe what we think is a better horse, a faster horse. She, I believe, was reluctant to do that, and so it's a tough one. Has the debate been particularly passionate about it, or is it on the issue itself, or is it more of the legal point of view?
Abortion bills are always passionate. That people feel very strongly on both sides of that issue, and it's always going to bring out heated debate and pointed debate, and but there was a lot of constitutional legal topics woven into this year's debate that beyond just the pro-life, pro-abortion kind of back and forth.
Senator Landen, something you brought up as well is the topic of what I think the layman might refer to as drug court. The term that's now more in favor is treatment courts. What are they, and what is the legislative issue this year regarding them?
Well, those treatment courts run specifically to those entering the system because of drugs. The Chief Justice has made it one of her goals to move those treatment courts underneath the judiciary branch, and we had a good.
And where are they now?
They are just simply located under the Department of Health in the executive branch. Those two entities came together, developed this bill, and Representative Washut and the rest of the Judiciary Committee worked at during the interim. Came forward with a bill that will transfer those courts over to the judiciary branch. I think that will be a needed shot in the arm. They, of course, are staffed by our judges, and so that's the opportunity we have to get people the help they need before they get too deeply into the system. And so that's a good bill, and it passed the Senate, and it'll be headed over to the House now.
And the executive branch is favoring it, at least as it exists now. So it's not an antagonistic thing. We're not trying to take it from one and give it to the other. Here's maybe the better place where it belongs.
That's correct. It's really a top-level administrative sort of issue, and everything that the Department of Health, Department of Family Services does for those individuals now, none of that will change, just the administration of the program. And I think that'll give an opportunity. The judiciary branch may be able to avail themselves to other grant kinds of funding and resources that maybe the executive branch didn't have. So,
in the interim, when we talked about that switch, the Department of Health is our largest department in the state of Wyoming. It's very, very big, and so treatment courts, in their grand scheme of things, are just this small little cog over here on. But for the judicial branch, it's a central, important component. So I think the emphasis, administrative emphasis that will be achieved by having that in the judicial branch is well worth the change.
I think my general understanding of the treatment court has been, here's someone who has violated the law by the letter of the law, but who isn't necessarily considered a criminal in the sense that that person might be under many other statutes, and the idea being that this is a way to treat it as a specific classification of offense that warrants different consideration, and also takes some of the burden off the criminal courts at the same time.
The judge that runs treatment court is a criminal court judge, right? So they're sharing that responsibility. But I always remember Tom Pagel, former DCI director, former Casper police chief, was always fond of saying, we have criminals who use drugs and we have addicts who commit crimes. And differentiating those two classes and getting those addicts into the treatment area that they need, because sometimes, overcoming an addiction is tremendously hard work. And sometimes you need a little cheerleader in the background, and that judge can play that role. It can also be almost like a parent, right? To have a little tough love you do it or else power to encourage that individual, but then celebrate their successes along the way as they walk that road to recovery.
You know, that part of the world is something that we're dealing a lot with. We've had several bills dealing with the fentanyl problem in Wyoming, and the Chief Justice has actually suggested that we may look at low-level crime diversion programs going forward, which fits right into that, what the co-chairman was talking about. I think that you're going to hear a lot more about the drug problems that we face in Wyoming and what we can do about it.
Some of these fentanyl issues have come before judiciary as well. As legislators often say, we're asked to solve problems. We try to solve problems. What's a legislative approach to solving a fentanyl problem, hypothetically, for example?
Boy, we had a bill that's on its way to the House now, which establishes fentanyl as one of the drugs that if you have it in the home with a child, that's a child endangerment issue, and so we have placed that in a bill to make that a felony. Is that gonna curb all of that drug coming into Wyoming? No, it's a little piece that maybe we can help our law enforcement out there to protect our people. The issue there also is the fact that our law enforcement folks, our first responders and our sheriffs and chiefs have to respond to certain things, and then you have that fentanyl that can be very, very dangerous.
It's a transdermal drug, which means it comes right through your skin. So if those officers inadvertently touch, they can absorb. They might inhale some, so it's very problematic.
Puts them at risk in a way that dealing with a DUI offender, in that way at least, would not.
Right, and you reach in somebody's pocket and you expose your bare hand perhaps to fentanyl, and so that's a real concern. We had a bill on the House side. Unfortunately, it didn't survive, but I thought it was a good one to try and provide some money to do. Canines are not always trained to detect fentanyl. So we have some canines in Wyoming that are trained to detect fentanyl, but not all of our police canines are trained to detect fentanyl. So we were trying to put some money to add some trained dogs out there to help us detect and interdict some of the flow of fentanyl in Wyoming. And unfortunately, that didn't make it through before the cutoff.
That sounds like it might be an issue that would come up again, as the fentanyl issue is not going to be resolved with one legislative session.
No, I think going into the interim, I think the co-chairman and I will be talking about that, and certainly a piece of that I think will end up in the conversation.
We had a joint training session. We're trying something a little new, that during the session, as time allows, the two committees come together and just get joint briefings. And our very first one, the first week of the session, was with the DCI director and learning more about the fentanyl situation in Wyoming, and I think it's very eye-opening.
You're both committee chairs. Sometimes when I watch a committee meeting, I see what I might call an activist person in the chair who comes into that meeting saying, I want this bill to pass, or I want this bill to be stopped, or I want this to happen on this bill. Others don't do that. Senator Landen, what's your approach when you have a bill before your committee? How do you go about it, and what's your objective typically?
That's a great question, and every chairman I've known has a little different style. Mine has been, I always try to center on the people of Wyoming, the people who the bill affects, the people who bring the bill. After all, that's what we're down here for, is to represent them. I try to make it the best environment possible for them. It can be nerve-wracking. It's something when they come to testify in front of legislators, that can be pretty intimidating. And I try to bring the level down as far as I can so that we can just have a good conversation about the bills. I think atmosphere is really important, and I think respect and decorum. I kind of demand that in the committee meetings, and it seems to have worked pretty well.
I know that's been a priority set by President Driskill before the session, that we're going to have at the very least, we'll have civil proceedings.
Yeah.
I watch your your hearings, and I always hear you say again and again and again, committee, what's your pleasure on the bill? Because I get the feeling that what you want is to make sure everyone is heard and that the bill, if it's going to move forward, has its best chance to be heard by the larger group.
Well, I think as chairman, you're not only leading the committee, you're managing the flow of all of that information, all those bills, and along the way, sharing a little bit of expertise that we've learned in all the years that we've been here. I think that is useful, and hopefully bringing other legislators along so they can be chairman someday. So, yeah, I think your committee members are very important.
Representative Washut, is this your first session as a chairman?
It is.
How's that been going for you?
There's a learning curve, absolutely true, and I think some of the important things that committee chairmen are expected to do occur out of the limelight. You get bills that come to you that your committee never hears. You know, it's up to you as chairman to decide what bills do we have time for and what bills do we not have time for. And so you have to make some tough calls sometimes, and it's upsetting to sponsors on their bills when they want their bill heard, and you're saying, we just don't have time to hear that bill.
As you mentioned, sometimes it's your own bill.
Yeah,
One
of mine met its demise, yeah.
I'll ask Senator Driskill here in a couple of minutes, but I believe the total number of bills that at least came before the session was more than 500. So I don't know how many are still, but at some point you get that you just have to make some tough decisions.
Well, you do, and like co-chairman, I parked a bill. I've kind of spent the last 4 or 5 years looking at the domestic violence issues that we have in our state, and a bill that would have kind of closed a loophole. I set that one aside because we just didn't have time, and so we'll try to get to that later.
It might get a better hearing at a different time.
That's
not
correct,
that it's
yeah.
necessarily a bad bill, it's just not the right moment for
That's
it.
right.
And I say, you know, sometimes these bills come along and they're like soup. You know, they're good the first day, but you put them in the refrigerator for 2 or 3 days, and they might taste even better by the end of the week, right?
I've never heard that, but
I hadn't either, but I will never forget. We're out of time for this segment. I want to thank you both. These are busy, busy days for legislators, and we're here. We have to do this early in the morning, and you've come maybe earlier than you typically would to be with us. I very much appreciate it. Senator Bill Landen, Representative Art Washut, thanks for being with us on Capitol Outlook.
appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Next, we'll talk with one of the 2 top leaders at the legislature, the President of the Wyoming Senate. Stay with us. Welcome back to Capitol Outlook. I'm Steve Peck of WyomingPBS. We're joined now by the President of the Wyoming Senate, Senator Ogdin Driskill of Senate District Number 1. I always remember that. That's an easy one to remember. You've been with us a couple of times before, sort of serving as giving us a milepost as we move through the session. We're now to the latter portions of it, and we're past the point now where we're introducing legislation to the point where we're trying to pass it. Was that fair to say?
Yeah, Steve, we're really at an interesting point in the session. You know, last Friday was the last day for the files to leave their house. So we know today how many actual bills there's going to be, both House and Senate. We know what's there. And we're down to the end now. It's crossover time, and from here out, we start passing bills that the governor either will sign or not sign and come out of our bodies.
So by crossover, you mean there are bills that have passed the House. The bill in Wyoming has to pass both the House and the Senate. Some of these have passed the House now. They've come to the Senate. You were checking just moments ago to get a sense of how many of those you might be dealing with today. Where does that all stand?
So I couldn't get pulled up on the purple sheet, but it looks like there's probably 30 or 35 House files left to be heard in the Senate. And I believe the House is sitting on probably close to 100 Senate files left. And very likely, I would guess they'll end up the same as they did before. The body's new and they're doing a lot of deliberation, a lot of good debates, and that necessarily means the body slows down and probably means some Senate files die on the House side that don't get heard, which is, that's disappointing to some of the members, but it's kind of the way the process works. I believe the Senate probably will have all the House files done by the end of next week.
When you say have them done, that means what exactly?
They've gone through committee, they've come to the committee of the whole on the floor, and they've either passed or not. So we're going to be pretty slow in the Senate the last 10 days of the session, assuming that we don't have a problem with either the capital construction bill, the supplemental budget bill, or the ARPA bill. Those are the three big ones. And assuming those get negotiated out between the two houses, the CapCon bill and the supplemental budget have both passed both bodies now. So they're down to, well, I think CapCon has not gone through the House, but the supplemental budget's done. They've appointed a conference committee. I expect we'll do one today. We're not a long ways apart. We're, I think, $1.5 million difference between the two, which is kind of interesting, on over $1 billion. But there's differences between the levels of them. So we funded one thing to this level, they cut to this level. So the conference committee will take those differences and they'll find middle ground on them. As we're allowed in the conference committee, the high cap is the highest amount that either body did, and the low cap is the lowest amount. And the conference committee can go anywhere in between and sit. So you can't cut something you don't like out of the other side, and they can't do the same to you. And it's just truly a negotiation where you end up at.
CapCon, capital construction, that means state money that's going to be spent building things typically, right?
It is, and it's just critical. So that bill contains all of the community college construction, and some maintenance dollars on it, some other projects, and then it has the UW, and I can kind of give you a preview of what came out of the Senate. Was UW has always been a tough one, and we ended up with huge cost overruns because of inflation at the university. So it includes a big chunk of money there. For the people that don't know, we're building new dorms at UW.
And this is an enormous undertaking, isn't it, financially and logistically?
Well, to give an idea, and it's almost frightening if you're a person that deals normally, the cost overruns are in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
And this is because am I right in saying that these plans were drawn up and approved initially some time ago, and just because of inflation, it's just a whole different bill practically now, isn't it?
The last couple of years you couldn't get concrete, you couldn't get materials. So the projects not only are delayed, but the materials are used and have increased, and some of it's contracted, some of it's not. And then of course you have change orders. When you get into massive projects, you get in the middle of it and you realize that maybe you didn't design something quite correctly, or you're over budget and you have to value engineer. So it gets really hard. That's UW, we actually kind of bid off in the Senate for the first time, and with sideboards and some brakes on it, we've approved some projects that have been out there for over a decade in the case of Corbett Pool, and said, look, we're going to go ahead and green light them. We're in a time of some surplus. We're going to let you go ahead and get those designed out, and let's take a look at getting those finished. Got some big projects for community colleges, and then of course we've got our K-12 stuff that isn't actually in CapCon, but all affects it because those monies that run.
Yeah, I was a community college trustee for some years, and I know that in many communities, the community colleges are the big builders in the entire area. Something that happens at the college is something that the whole community will end up using, and typically it's the college that leads the way on getting these things proposed, designed, built, occupied, and utilized. So they're extremely important, and it's a competitive process, isn't it?
And they're different. UW comes to us with projects, and they say, this is what we'd like to see built, and the legislature acts directly. Community college, as you said, you were on a commission, so that you have 7 community colleges, and they all compete against each other. And maybe that's not right. I'm not sure they'd like to say compete.
They all have their priorities, though.
They bring their projects, and the commission ranks those projects because there's always more wants than there is ability to pay for. So we've really put together a good process. And then I'll back on the CapCon. There's a few projects that just kind of came in out of the edge on it. And one of them that had kind of massive floor debate is a crosswalk across between F.E. Warren and Frontier Days Park, and everybody, well, it's a rodeo one. Well, they're proposing to build a lot of houses there, and it's really a link between the air base, which is really an economic driver and a big factor in Cheyenne, and it really is a link between them and the city of Cheyenne. And I was one of the ones, I'm a proponent of it, and I think it's a great project. F.E. Warren, if you look through the legislature, we have numbers of members serving that are old F.E. Warren people. They tend to stay here when they come. Cheyenne's a great town, and the town's full of old F.E. Warren people.
This is an interesting point that you bring up, or leads to another one. What's the nearest, what's the zip code for you where you live? What town is that?
So Devil's Tower, I lived with the postmaster for 30 years.
You did. So Devil's Tower has its own zip code.
Yeah.
And that's a small community, it's safe to say.
There's no people in
No
it.
people,
It's just
really.
3 businesses.
But the towns
there.
near you are Moorcroft and...
Moorcroft, Hewlett, Sundance.
So
I'm
these
about
are
30 miles from each of them.
So, and Cheyenne is bigger than all 3 of those put together by a factor of 10, probably.
So, our county's 7,000.
Yeah.
Cheyenne's 10 times bigger than our county.
Yet you, from a representative from a rural district far from Cheyenne, have a big, and so does everybody, a big roles to play in considering what's going to happen in the city of Cheyenne. That's what our representative legislature drawn from across the state has to do again and again and again.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we've seen this play out in the Senate this week. It's really interesting. Part of the projects that they were presented as this is pork. And, you know, one man's pork is another man's food that he lives on. And so every community in the state has things they'd like to see. We all want our communities to be better places. And so the legislature necessarily, a lot of these projects, because of the size and what they are driven with state dollars. So you really do have to, if you're from a Hewlett or Devil's Tower and you're doing a project, you've got 1 vote out of 30 and you better convince everybody else that it makes sense. And the same's true for Cheyenne is, you know, I meet pretty steady with the mayor of Cheyenne, and I meet with different people out of Casper, these towns, and you know, they're there to lobby me for projects that makes their town a better place. And that's one of the things I'm really proud of in Wyoming is these years of surplus, we try to save a big chunk of the money, but we also try to invest a big chunk of it in our people in our area to make the state a better place to stay, not only for our residents, but also to hopefully attract some businesses that come and help build that tax base for us.
Earlier in an interview on our show, you talked about your plan as the Senate president to keep some of the, almost a cliche term, the hot button social issues, I guess, toward the end of the introductory bill process, so that the inevitably rising level of temper and emotion in that debate would not interfere with earlier processes, if I'm putting that accurately. Now we're to the point where you can't do that any longer. And one of the tough bills that's coming forward has to do with abortion law in Wyoming. Earlier guests talked about just some of the logistical maneuvering that's going on. Do we want to actually repeal one bill and replace it with another before the other bills even taken effect? And as you mentioned yourself, I think you used the term, these can be tough bills. Now we're to the point where that's happening. Has that bill come to the Senate yet?
I'm not sure what's come from the House. I haven't looked at them, but we did our slate of them at the last. So anybody that watched, other than just a handful, the gun bills, the abortion bills, and the property tax bills all came up the last week in the Senate. And it was as I expected. We had very sharp debates. We spent some time visiting with members on our decorum. It gets really hard. Passions get high, people mean a lot, and actually on one of the bills, I'm sure you're aware, we actually had a spectator that was up there that was hurt enough by one of the bills that made an outburst that we actually stopped the Senate and adjourned for a bit while they went and tracked her down, and I went and caught her in the hallway and visited, and it's hard. She was very hurt. It was one of the transgender bills that was up that was very difficult. Her family is affected by it.
I'm not asking you to betray a confidential conversation you had. What was your purpose in wanting to speak with that person yourself?
I didn't want to. I actually came down and she was sitting out here at the statue of Washut and she had a picture in her lap and she said, I'd like to visit with you. And I said, yeah. And she showed me a picture of her family and, you know, she had tears running down her face and said, you know, this directly affects my family and it's very painful. And why did you vote the way you did? Because you voted for what I thought was really bad. And I told her, I said, you know, from my end is, you know, I don't want to do anything to hurt you or your family, but I got to do what I think's the right thing. And the really hard part is, what is the right thing? And I can't answer that, you know, for my children, and I talked about it, is if I had children in that situation, would I think differently? And I'm not sure. It's really hard because, you know, I don't want to see children make bad decisions that are irreversible. The flip side of it is I want all our children to be happy. And so we have to make those hard decisions. They are not fun decisions for anybody. And unlike a lot of stuff in Washington, if you're in the Wyoming Legislature, you cannot leave the floor for a vote, and you can't say, I don't want to vote. You will vote thumbs up or thumbs down. And when you're in those issues that just crush you, either morally or mentally, that's very hard to do that, and it's hard on the members. You walk off the floor and you see people, I've seen people cry on the floor, I've seen them cry off the floor. It's hard decisions.
I mean, that's another difference between here and Washington. I doubt if Leader McConnell steps out of the chamber and sees a citizen from his Senate, from his state, who's sitting there with a picture, may I speak to you, please? Not saying that he doesn't speak to constituents, but the level of access that's possible here is just
second to none. That's one thing Wyoming's proud of is, you know, I don't care if it's the governor of Wyoming or a legislator. If you say you can't have access to them, it's merely because you haven't tried very hard. Because I can tell you, I've had people that have wanted very hard to get after the governor on hard issues. Every single one of them has been able to get on the phone or drive down here and meet with him. That's unheard of in other states.
And you better be ready to do that if you want this office.
You do. That's what Wyoming's all about. We without a doubt have the best citizen legislature in the United States, and I can say it with conviction, is there's second to none is there citizen access like there is in Wyoming, and the transparency that we have, and the transparency is incredible.
Give us the Senate President's overview of where the supplemental budget bill stands here toward the end of the week.
So I hope I don't hex things as we get together, but it's the closest I've ever seen. As I mentioned earlier, it's about $1.5 million apart, maybe 20 or 30. The big issue on it is where are we going to put the surplus funds? And so the Senate took a position, and they gave us really a wide range. The Senate put $1 billion in permanent savings. The House, I believe, left 300 or 400 between the two funds. And so we'll come somewhere in between, but there's a new idea out there, and I'm happy to present it because it's out now. House Bill 89 has the bolts how it works, and these are called reserve accounts, and we've always kind of had them, but we're setting up a number of reserve accounts, and they're called 5X reserve accounts. They'll have 5 times spending, 5 years worth of spending put in them, and it will allow those accounts to raise interest on a similar higher level as the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, which that's our higher performing fund. That pushes 5.5%, 6% returns. It's about 30% of our budget now, 25 to 30. Those funds will be able to be there, but the permanent fund, once we put it in there, you can't ever get a hold of that money in a bad time. And these reserve accounts are going to give us really a stability in our government. Assuming it goes as planned, they'll come through. And so probably the big savings of the Senate, if the reserve accounts come, we'll put about $640 million in to fund those accounts. That will change how your government works. The people at home that look, it should flatten out some of these big surpluses, big downfalls. Since I've been in, twice we've been over $1 billion deficit, and this time, for the first time, we're over $1 billion surplus. And those are crazy numbers.
That's real
when you
money.
look at it. And
this has been an issue for debate for a long time. There's all this money locked up, as some people describe it. But in case people are wondering what the objective behind it was, now, years later, we're beginning to see it. These big accounts earn money that we do get to spend.
Unheard of nationally is, our dollars are probably, we're in the top 10 on sovereign wealth funds for a state with less than 600,000 is incredible. Per capita, it's I'm sure some of the highest in the world outside of maybe some of the oil producing countries overseas. The vision of the people that formed the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund was incredible. The base of it was this, is normally you distribute that money, Alaska does it, and it goes back into your population. And they said, look, our mineral money is one-time money. It's not ours. It belongs to future generations as well as ours. So rather than spending it, we're going to put it there. We know oil, gas, and coal is not going to be there forever in Wyoming. And so when people come to me and say, why can't I have that money? That $25 billion is my money. And I'm like, no, it belongs to the people of Wyoming in perpetuity. And this money was extracted on a one-time. And it's enviable. Other states, when I talked to them, I was just at Utah, and I was talking to the president of their Senate. And how do you fund your government? How does it go? And well, 30% of it comes from interest and dividend income. And he was like, you've got to be kidding me. You're not taxing and appropriating that money. I said, no, 1/3 comes from that income. And that 1/3, when you look at people out there, and I can tell everyone, that's 1/3 that you don't pay. Those are property taxes, sales taxes, other things. Those are paid for by that good judgment, which proud to say that was long before I came, and it's really come to fruit.
And in a surplus year, the opportunity exists now to put more there so that it could earn more later.
I think at a minimum, we're going to get around $300 to $400 million in there. So I'll use $500 million because I think that's kind of a happy medium. And $500 million at 5% is $25 million a year that comes back.
And that money does get spent.
And we do. We take that money, and that $25 million flows into different accounts, and it gets spent. But the corpus stays, and then of course we try in times of good, we pour that other 500 in there, and that inflation proofs the account. And that's what we call it. Is we all know that if you look at last year at 8% inflation, you probably lost on a net basis on your deal because the inflation was more than your returns were.
But there were other years recently when inflation was quite low where it gained on it.
A lot. We've done really well, and it makes it a lot easier to legislate. The more stable we can make our deal, and that's these reserve accounts I talked about, the more stable and level we are, the easier it is to legislate. Because before you come in, part of the freshmen talked about it, it's very hard to understand that when you say, I'm going to cut the budget by $100 million, it means we're looking somebody in the eye and saying, we're going to fire your husband, your wife, or not fill a position, so your husband or your wife will do more. And it affects people directly. Anytime you start talking big cuts, it's right there, and it's at home. And it only sounds like a number when you're talking about cutting. But when you actually do it, it turns into humanity. It means someone doesn't get access to something, and we've seen it, our snowplow drivers we didn't keep up. Wyoming's literally closed roads this winter because they didn't have drivers that could plow 24 hours a day. We're short. And for those of us that have an emergency or feel like you want to travel at night, that's part of what we're trying to figure out is how do you provide top-level services and do the most with the least. And our agencies, I can say, and for the ones that are listening, we're so proud of what our state employees have done by helping us keep those budgets lean and doing really a great job with what they do.
Senator, as always, you've provided us with a great roadmap, an overview, a checklist of where we stand. This is what the leader of the Senate's job is, among many others. Thanks for doing that again today. Maybe we'll have you back another time before the session ends or at the end of the session to talk about how it all went. For now, Senator Driskill, thanks for being with us on Capitol Outlook.
Thanks so much, Steve. Always proud to be here.
Wyoming prides itself on having a citizen legislature, which means that state representatives and state senators don't work full-time at the job. One of those citizen legislators is State Representative Trey Sherwood of Laramie. She won her first term in 2020 and won a second term last year. Now she's the chair of the Minority Party Caucus in the House. We first met Representative Sherwood as a guest on our Wyoming Chronicle show when we interviewed her last fall in Laramie, where she works full-time on economic development in the University City.
So I am the executive director of Laramie Main Street. We are a nonprofit, and so I have the great pleasure of working collaboratively with a hands-on board of directors, with our businesses, our property owners, our local government, and stakeholders. So I am the convener and the connector for downtown.
Something great happened to Laramie Main Street earlier this year. What was that?
So we won a Great American Main Street Award, and that is like the Oscars of downtown development work. So we were recognized by our peers and National Main Street, and we are the third Wyoming community to receive that award. So I believe per capita, Wyoming has the most amount of Great American Main Street Award winners.
In doing the work that led to the award, Sherwood and her committee worked on a data-driven, detail-oriented procedure for more than a decade, with impressive results.
We pulled past board members, past staff members together to reflect on our accomplishments. We pulled data from 2005, so we track monthly what's considered an ROI, a return on investment. So number of private dollars invested downtown, public dollars, volunteer hours, number of new businesses, and track all of that. And so to be able to go back to 2005 and realize we've had over 100 net new businesses open. Downtown in the district. We had growth even during the pandemic. So Main Street work is a lot about head and heart. And so that application was gathering the story, the like why we're successful, and it's about the people. And then the heart or the head part is the data, right? Looking back and saying like how much has been invested and how many new entrepreneurs and new jobs.
Sherwood said Great American Main Street's time-tested procedure works best when the problem is approached from multiple angles at the same time.
They want to see that you have local government support. So not putting all of your eggs in one basket and saying, you know, we're really good at having festivals, but we don't take care of the needs of our businesses. Or we're really good at taking care of the maintenance on our buildings, but our sidewalks are cracking. So again, that holistic approach to how you take care of a community and revitalize a space.
Support for economic development always is strong in principle, but definitions of it can vary. In Laramie, Sherwood asked her community members a specific question.
So the bare minimum I expect of our business owners, knowing it is a two-way street, is to let me know what they need. That is, in Wyoming, we're so tenaciously stubborn and individualistic that sometimes we struggle in silence. And so building that trust with those entrepreneurs and saying, it is okay for you to open up and be vulnerable with me and say, I'm struggling with QuickBooks, or I'm struggling to negotiate my lease agreement. It is our job, my job as the Main Street director, to get the businesses the resources they need. So it doesn't mean I have to be the expert in everything, but I have to know where I can go on campus or to the Business Council, to the Wyoming Women's Business Center to find that tool that that business owner needs. So the minimum that I want them to do when they interact with us is ask for help.
So I might have expected you to say, or someone might have expected you to say, well, at the very minimum, we want to put up a cute address number or paint the mailbox or something, but it's not necessarily that.
No, I mean, visual merchandising is very important. We know that 70% of new customers and sales actually come from the way your storefront looks, and is it inviting, right? So that goes back to the built environment. But a business may not know how to set up their storefront in a way that's visually engaging. So again, that goes back to ask for help, and
or
we
think
will
that they couldn't afford it, or
yes, exactly,
wouldn't know who to turn to help. All
exactly.
those things. As Sherwood sees it, economic development efforts at the community level often fail for the same reason: initial enthusiasm, but lack of follow-through.
There was a lot of false starts or a lot of incomplete starts. So in the 80s, we had a downtown development authority. In the 90s, that turned into more of a merchants association. And they were focused on one of what should be many holistic approaches to revitalization. So in the early 2000s, the city said, we want to apply. This is when Governor Dave Friedenthal was in office. We want to apply. We want to be an inaugural Main Street community in Wyoming, and try this out. So there was a application, there was a business inventory, you had to show buy-in from your community, so it was a pretty extensive process. And at that time, what was left of our Downtown Development Authority and our Merchants Association and the city all got together to work on this application. So eventually all of these organizations came together under what is the Laramie Main Street umbrella, and here we are.
Here's another piece of advice from this enthusiastic state legislator when working on economic development: be inclusive.
it is the board's directive to keep that bigger picture vision in mind, but also to roll up their sleeves and be in community and do the work. And so I have members from the university, from downtown, from the LGBT community, from our younger populations. Again, Laramie's median age is 28, so we want to make sure that those voices are at the table. And we're always thinking about ways that we can reach out and collaborate with new partners and let that diversity of voices drive the vision and the execution of our strategies.
When you drive through Wyoming, as we do a lot, these little towns are pretty cool, aren't they?
Yes, a lot of character.
Yeah, and you, I'm sure you, as the overachieving high energy person that you are, you probably go through often and think, boy, give me a 6 months here, or let me talk to get a group of people together, and I could get you started toward making it, just improving it as a place to live.
I see potential in every single one of our communities. I tend to be that shopper that's like, why did you start your business? What successes have you had? And, even sharing the resources, again, from the Wyoming Business Council or UW with business owners that I might run into in Riverton who are like, man, I'm really struggling with this. Well, did you know there was this resource? Again, there's just this beautiful network, and every community has potential if they stay true to themselves and be the best versions of who they want to be unique, celebrate your assets, and bring people together.
Amid the success of her Laramie Main Street work, Representative Trey Sherwood now brings her economic development credentials to the legislature. That's all for Capital Outlook this week. Thanks for watching, and join us again next week.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And by the members of Wyoming PBS. Thank you for your support.